Coming up on this episode of the All Aboard podcast, Phil talks about what it was like to be a rail enthusiast in Boston, Massachusetts in the late 1990s through the mid-2000s. Have your tickets out of the envelope? All aboard, please. Now boarding on track number 8 is train number 1, the All Aboard podcast, your twice-weekly excursion into transportation excellence, and I am your conductor, Phil Bell, Enterprise B, PB Crisp, Mr. 645, a highly trained rail enthusiast who is rapidly becoming a highly trained broadcast specialist, and as always, I am blessed to be holding the E. Hunter Harrison Chair here at the Bell Institute for Advanced Railroad Studies, where there are no degrees, because the learning never ceases. And after some absolute insanity on the road, it's great to be back behind this, the Brunswick Green PLB microphone. Look, I know I promised you that we'd be talking about regional railroads today and the Class 1 railroads that are involved with them, but I wanted to push that back a little bit. We'll be doing that on Wednesday. It's President's Day. It's a holiday, so I wanted to relax and have a little bit of fun with you, and I wanted to talk about my time as a rail fan in Boston, Massachusetts. So I went to Boston University between 1999 and 2004, and I worked in Boston from 2004 up until 2008 when I moved to the Washington, D.C. area, and it was quite a time of change for railroading. So first off, for those of you who are watching on Rumble and YouTube, why am I dressed up as a Mets fan yet again? That's because I was known as the Mets guy at the Boston University campus, because I love the Mets and I always wore my Mets stuff all the time, and of course, I made every effort to do as much rail fanning and, anything related to rail as possible. The one thing I didn't do, though, and I'm really bummed out about it, is I didn't take very many pictures. And that's because I just wasn't a very good photographer with the SLR that my aunt had given me. She got tired of me using her Olympus camera, so she said, "Hey, I'm getting you this for Christmas. It's a great camera. I still have it." I didn't know how to use it, though, so I didn't take almost any pictures during that time. But I got to see a lot through the pictures in my mind's eye. So, like I said, I studied at Boston University, located on MBTA's Green Line branch, and that is running right through the heart of campus, and that's how almost every student got around. The university would provide buses with Crystal Transport, but we could ride for free going outbound on the Green Line. So if you were at the center of campus, you're at the eastern edge, western edge, wherever it was, you could go. As long as you were going outbound, you could ride for free. If you were going inbound, the fare was 85 cents. So what most students did is we walked if we were going toward the city, and we would take the subway, the Green Line, the MBT Green Line, going out of town. And the Green Line was the B branch for us, but it was also near the C and D lines, which came to the eastern edge of campus at Kenmore Square. And so want to give you a little look at what Kenmore Square station looked like then as now. So Kenmore is located right near the famous Citgo sign that everybody knows about with the Boston Red Sox in Fenway Park. And it's an important location because the Central Subway runs east from the Kenmore Square station all the way up to North Station, and that's where it goes to Copley, Arlington, Heinz Convention Center, ICA, and then, of course, the key junction locations of Park Street and Government Center on its way up. But what you're seeing right here is an MBTA Type 7 Kinky Chariot, so-called LRV light rail vehicle, making a stop at Kenmore Square. And so if you're a Boston University student at that time, as I was, you would spend a lot of time here because that's how you got out of campus and went downtown. The C line, which ran just to the south of campus along Beacon Street, the B line runs along Commonwealth Avenue, which is right through Boston University. The C line runs through Beacon Street, which is to the south, also passes through here. And then the D line, which is the former New York Central Highland branch that was tied into the subway in the 1960s after the New York Central stopped running commuter trains on it, sold it to the state, which became the famous M.T.A, Massachusetts Transportation Authority, of the Kingston Trio song. They converted that to what they call a high-speed line, and if you ever have a chance to ride it, it's now the D line. It is a lot of fun because you're in these streetcars, which generally don't go very fast at all, maybe 20, 25 miles an hour, but on the D line, they get up to 55 miles an hour. And so it's a really exhilarating experience. You'd never think 55 miles an hour would be that much fun, but quite frankly, it really is. Now, also, I want to show you a little bit of the outside of the Kenmore Square station, and that's just so you can see the Citgo sign and the bus. This is also part of campus life. Obviously, the Citgo sign being really famous with the buses because they operate up and down Commonwealth Avenue as well. And that is because of a very interesting thing that happened, which we're very, I should say, unhappy about still as rail fans and rail advocates. And that was the abolition of the A line. You see, MBTA, if you ever look at a map, you'll notice, you say, well, wait a minute, you've got these branches, why does it start with B? Isn't the letter A the first letter of the alphabet? Yes, of course it is. And so here's a map of actually what the Green Line looked like at the time when I was riding. For those of you on YouTube and Rumble, you see the B for Boston College, C to Cleveland Circle, D to Riverside, and the E line, which went to Arbor Way, which is located on the Southwest Corridor line, the former New Haven rail line that goes down to Providence and ultimately New York City. And you also see that there's a little service disruption, a quote-unquote temporary service disruption on the E line. But the E line and the A line shared one thing, and that is that they were both mostly street-running lines. The A line going west of Packard's Corner out to the Watertown Car House was right in the middle of Brighton Avenue, and then a variety of streets going to the west. The MBTA did not like, after it took over, operating the trolleys in the street. And that was because of the reasons you can probably figure out. There's a lot of automobile interaction. The cars, it doesn't matter if the people are from the area. They really don't know how to interact with the streetcar. They don't like to. As a result, you typically see a lot of slowdowns of the service. And one of the toughest things about operating a rapid transit line is that you have to be able to maintain headways. If you think about it, the next time you get on a subway and you're standing there, even though you can see nowadays how long it's going to be before the next train shows up, same goes with streetcars in many major cities, if it ends up going any more than 5 to 7 minutes, most people tend to get antsy and, quite frankly, they lose faith in riding the system. Well, think about in a time when you don't have any idea of when the next train is coming and it's going to be delayed because there's a lot of cars along the way that just simply won't get out of the way to let it go down the street. Or because automobile traffic is so heavy, there's no place for it to go. So throughout the 1970s, the MBTA looked for ways to limit operation of the A line, and they would from time to time have temporary suspensions of the service. And then in the 1980s, they decided to temporarily suspend it permanently and replaced it with the 57 bus. And they managed to do this for so long and only use the Arbor Way Car House as a place to scrap cars that a lot of residents along the corridor simply said, hey, why are these old tracks in the street? There's never a train on them except dilapidated streetcars going to get junked later. There's no reason we need it. And so they waited and continued to poll year after year after year until a majority of the residents said, we don't want the tracks anymore. Get rid of them, especially since you're not going to use them. And the MBTA said, okay, cool, no problem. And then they destroyed the rest of the A line just before I arrived in 1999, leaving only a small spur intact at the Packard's Corner section, which, interestingly enough, is where I lived. And that short spur would be used occasionally for additional trains that were added during the morning and evening rush hours, as well as for your Boston Red Sox game. So when they had extra trains that they needed to store somewhere, they would park them on the little spur, little bit of the A line that still remained in existence until that was eventually taken out in, I believe it was 2002. 2001, somewhere around the September 11th attacks. So this is kind of the backdrop, and I spent a lot of time. I really did enjoy riding the Green Line. One of the best things was, of course, being able to travel westbound for free on the B branch, and so it was really easy to say where I was going to school specifically, which was Boston University's College of General Studies, aka Crayons, Glue, and Scissors. That's what they called it. Yes, your buddy Phil was probably not the best student, and that's because I spent all my time reading about trains. I couldn't care less about what they were talking about in school. but out to where I lived, which was Packard's Corner. And Packard's Corner was a very interesting area, not only because you had not only because this is where the streetcars went around a big curve, and there you can see Packard's Corner with Star Market in the background, a Green Line Type 8 streetcar leading a Type 7. And that's what you see in the consist there. That's from 2011, a little after my time there ended. But Packard's Corner was also noteworthy because that's really where you got away from the edge of the Boston University campus into the more residential area, which really meant that it was the area where the actual students tended to end. And then you got people who were a little bit older students or your early 20 somethings where they lived and went to the bars and so forth. And the Green Line was right in the center of it. So this is how you got there. And of course, as the day would wear on, once you, especially Thursday nights, Friday nights, Saturday nights, and the MBTA went from 2-car sets, as you see in this picture here, to a 1-car set on ostensibly lower traffic, that's when you would see them just being packed full of drunk people who were going from either one bar to the other or going from whatever bar they're at to get home until the service ended initially around 2 a.m., although that was later pared back to 12:30, if I recall correctly, as part of the ongoing rounds of MBTA budget cuts, which never seemed to end. But just to go back a little bit, because I think it's fun, I first went to Boston in 1994. Now, I was in the 8th grade, and my aunt said we needed to go on a college trip. Now, I don't know how many 8th graders go on college trips, but it was really just her excuse to go up and visit Boston. And she's much more of a productivity person than I am, but no problem. So we had to do something productive, which was go look around colleges. Little did I know I would end up actually living there. And how did we get there? Of course, we took the train. And the train looked a lot like this. This is Amtrak's Night Owl, train number 66, which is the train that we took initially to get from Newark Penn Station to Boston. And just to give you a little bit of background, do not go to Newark Penn Station in the evenings or overnight unless you absolutely have to. They keep that place, and we're talking about Newark, New Jersey here, they keep that place, the waiting room is closed, it's full of a bunch of vagrants, and the only thing you can do is go in these smaller waiting areas that are on the platforms, assuming you know what platform that your train will be arriving on. And I remember we had my mother drive us over there. It's the middle of the night because at the time, the Night Owl would take long layovers in New York City, as well as extended layovers in New Haven and Providence. And this was to, number one, make the schedule long enough so that people who were using the Heritage Fleet sleeper, and yes, they had an actual sleeper attached to the train, which at the time ran between Boston and Washington overnight, so the people in the sleeper could actually sleep. If they ran at track speed, which in some places is up to 125 miles per hour for the Amfleet cars with the AEM 7s, although limited to 110 when the Heritage Fleet sleeper and, of course, the baggage cars are added in, you wouldn't really have much time to sleep. You just get there and then you could stay in the car, of course, but it wouldn't really make much sense. So you had these extended layovers as the train went on. And Amfleet 1 cars, as you see here in the photo, pulled by AEM 7s. And this really got to be my favorite way to get back and forth to Boston when I went to college there. Anytime I had the opportunity, I would take the Night Owl. And look, I'm a single guy. I'm not really worried. I'm pretty sure if I run into anybody who wants to steal anything from me, I'll be able to take them. I'm tough. And hey, I never had any problems. And I got to see some really interesting things. But that trip on the Night Owl is what really awakened my interest in Massachusetts railroading and New England, because before that, it was just something I had read about in books. But we get up there, and this was also, as an aside for those of you who are sports fans, during the time when the Seattle Mariners had to take an emergency road trip because tiles were falling out of the roof of the Kingdome. So what we were able to do is actually go to a game at Fenway Park, sit 2 rows off the field level, and see Randy Johnson pitch for the Seattle Mariners, which was just amazing. So we'll stick to the issues here, but I think you probably enjoy that. But anyway, this is my first introduction to Boston. We changed engines in New Haven, which is what the practice was at the time, because, of course, the electrification had not yet been extended to Boston. And so the AEM7 came off, and two F40PHs, as you see here on YouTube and Rumble, were put on, and they led us the rest of the way to get to South Station. Of course, we left a little bit early at Back Bay because our hotel was located near there in the Copley Square area. And what I was also able to see throughout my time in Boston, especially those early years, was that transition from going to make the engine changes at New Haven and having a lot of diesel equipment in South Station and otherwise, to now what became all electric operation. And so that is seen here with what a lot of people don't remember. You all remember Acela Express, and that's actually become a mainstay of the area from Boston to Washington. But this is what we originally had early on in what I was riding as 1999 became 2000, and that was Acela Regional. Methodically, Amtrak eliminated the Northeast Direct brand, which itself had replaced all of the individual train names such as Senator, Colonial, and Patriot, and replaced it with Northeast Direct originally. This happened around 1995, 1996. But then Amtrak replaced the Northeast Direct brand with Acela Regional, and that's when they gave the cars, as you can see a little bit in this photo, the really lava lamp inspired paint on the window band, and the weird name, which ended up, it was supposed to be Acela Express, Acela Regional, Acela Commuter, and so Acela Commuter would have replaced the clockers in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, Acela Regional replacing the Northeast Direct brand, and then Acela Express replacing Metroliner and becoming the halo offering, so to speak, for Amtrak in this area. Well, pretty quickly, they realized this was kind of confusing, because when people thought of Acela Express, they were saying Acela. Oh, I'm taking Acela. That's assuming they could pronounce it, because early on they would say things like Acela or Excella, but it's Acela, acceleration and excellence, which is originally what the name was supposed to stand for. And Acela Regional, you're thinking, I'm going to get on this high-speed train. You get on Acela Regional, which is higher speed, which could do 110 miles per hour in places where they were previously doing 100 to 103 with the F40PHs pulling the train and so on. Didn't quite work, so that's how we got the current branding of simply Regional. But I did see a lot of that, and it was interesting because early on, they had not actually put wire up going to the Southampton Street maintenance facility where Amtrak's trains are taken to be turned and cleaned after arriving in South Station. So it was no problem for something like the Lakeshore Limited, which would come in with either a Genesis, the P42s, which are still being delivered at the time, or F40PHs, usually a mix of both, as well as a few of the Genesis 1s that were still in operation at the time. They could go over to the maintenance facility with no problem. Same goes for the remaining Northeast Direct trains that were still pulled by diesel locomotives. And of course, the Night Owl, which became the Federal, the Night Owl, which became the Twilight Shoreliner, which I say is Amtrak's most beautiful train name ever. Then later on, the Federal, and simply a Regional now, which operated diesel for a while. But if you were coming up on an all-electric train, though, that equipment could not be taken to the maintenance facility without being pulled there by a diesel, because they hadn't strung wire there yet. So I remember one day actually getting to go out on the South Station platform and watching the process of bringing one of these electric consists down, and what it took for them to get the pantographs up. And it's not as simple a process as pushing a button. There actually was a laptop computer involved and so forth in getting this done. I've actually had a chance to see this multiple times, and all that it took to actually make that transition from what had been decades of diesel electric operation to now all electric operation. And that brings me to another, which was South Station, which was then a premier railfan spot for one simple reason. With the exception of loading Amtrak trains, you had free reign to go up and down the platform anywhere. And if you've listened to this podcast long enough, I love to complain about how Amtrak is very antisocial and ridiculous when it comes to platform access these days. But in those times, there was no problem. This was both before and after 9/11, which I did unfortunately have the opportunity to experience while I was in Boston. But that meant you had the opportunity to see every facet of the operation up close, and it was truly special, not only from a rail fan standpoint, but also from a larger standpoint, because remember, Amtrak and the MBTA, the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority, are wholly dependent on us, the taxpayer, to support their operations, whether it's by buying the tickets or by paying subsidies through taxes. It's very critical that all of these railroads are doing whatever they can to make sure people understand what it takes to run a railroad. So when someone like Amtrak or the MBTA or otherwise comes up with an absolutely phony excuse, and it is absolutely phony 100%, and saying that, no, you can't go out on the platform. Oh, no. We have security reasons or otherwise, aside from areas where there actually are narrow platforms like Penn Station, New York, you are depriving the funders, the people who support your operation, of the opportunity to see what they're spending their money on and why it's critical that you're willing to advocate for those as a taxpayer and as a citizen. So again, yet another reason why anybody who's out there listening from the Amtrak orbit should know that antisocial policy absolutely has to change, and because it matters for your paycheck and the future of this operation. Now, getting back to Boston and the MBTA, and just kind of being a rail fan in that time, another interesting facet of living out there was seeing the Grand Junction. And the Grand Junction was and is, I should say, a very interesting railroad, because it's the only thing that provides a connection between the south side operations of Amtrak and the MBTA, which are centered around Boston South Station, and then the north side operations, which are centered around Boston's North Station. So if you wonder, well, how do they get the Downeaster consists from Southampton Street, where a lot of Amtrak service takes place, to the north side where they operate out of North Station going up to Maine? Well, it's on this railroad, and you can see this is actually looking down from the BU Boston University Bridge as an Amtrak MP15 DC pulls some Amfleet cars across the Charles River. So getting a chance to see the non-revenue movements of Amtrak and the MBTA was very exciting, because not only did you get to see some of this equipment, such as your MP15s and the GP18s that the MBTA used to use to provide non-revenue and switching services at both of its main Boston stations, but it also meant you got to see a lot of this equipment that was either out of service, needed repair, or was having a special movement. And one of those special movements that I'm really bummed out that I never got the chance to document as a photographer, was when the circus train came to town, and it actually did make use of the Grand Junction as you see here. Again, this is where, me not being a highly trained broadcast specialist will sometimes get in the way here, and I do apologize. It looks like we managed to lose our circus train photos, but the circus train was actually parked along the Grand Junction for quite some time when they came in 2007. And as living near there, I got to walk across Beacon Yard every day and see the freight trains coming in and out. And one of the things that I did, because I remember getting up at something like 4 a.m. and saw this beautiful train getting backed into the yard. And remember, the circus train was, could be up to 50 cars or long or thereabouts. And so you're seeing all the passenger cars, the freight cars, the time they still included the elephants. So this was a really exciting thing to see as a rail enthusiast in Boston during that time. Now, after college, I moved over to Lower Alston. And Lower Alston is a section, which is exactly what its name implies. It's physically, at least it feels like, it's physically lower than the rest of Alston. I'm not sure if that's true, but it does feel like that. And it's located to the north of the Boston University campus and north of the Beacon Park Rail Yard. And the Beacon Park Rail Yard was for many years Conrail, CSX, Penn Central, and otherwise their entry into the area. And this is the view that I had for so many years as I was walking to and from work, or I should say to and from the MBTA Green Line to get to work. And what you see there is a single stack intermodal train path departing on what would be track 1, but actually was CSX's track that they used to get in and out, because at the time it was actually single track through this area between CP3 and CP4, which are the two control points at either end of the Beacon Park Yard. And you had a lot of general merchandise freight that was always in the area. But intermodal became something very important to CSX, because the main reason for their acquisition of Conrail and the lines that they got is because they wanted to control all of the I-95 rail corridor and intermodal shipments. So that was something that was big to them. And as a result, we got to see a lot of AC60s, SD40-2s, and anything they had, GP40-2s as well, anything they had that had cab signals, because the Boston and Albany main line then as now had cab signals. So there were a very small amount of locomotives that CSX owned that they could use to lead trains there. Another example, one of my favorites to see, were the Conrail SD80 MACs. And so seeing all of this pretty much every day as I walked to and from work was a lot of fun. And sometimes I would just stand there on the bridge which crosses over the Beacon Park Leeds, as well as the Mass Pike Cambridge Street Bridge, and watch the switching take place. And I remember Western Maryland GP40-2s being there, seeing some SD50s, British Columbia Railway SD40-2 one day. It was a lot of fun. Also, one of the most interesting things that came through during that period came in 2004, and this was Norfolk Southern's train to the Democrat National Convention, which you see here, that they sent. And this was in the era, and I'm actually not sure how much we're going to really see this going forward because of how polarized the political environment has gotten. But in 2000, 2004, you saw all the railroads put on a big show of bringing their trains to the various political conventions. Union Pacific most famously taking a large train to Philadelphia in 2000. And also in that year for the Republican convention for the Democrats, they sent 3985, a steam engine, along with a short consist there. Norfolk Southern sent this train, as you see, to Beacon Park Yard in Boston, and that's where it was used to receive delegates for the Democrats and so on. Of course, as you probably saw in the picture, what happens when you send a nice train to Boston? It got tagged. It got tagged with plenty of graffiti, and so that certainly made for a few interesting conversations among rail enthusiasts after that took place. So even though you felt like you were somewhat restricted as a rail fan because there wasn't the variety that you might have seen in some place like a Chicago or a Cleveland or otherwise, especially due to the cab signal requirements on almost all of the lines that were emanating from the area, it was neat to see some of these special trains as they came through, whether we're talking about the Circus train or the Norfolk Southern OCS. Now, Beacon Park Yard closed in 2013, and this was after several years of changes that CSX made in the area. Most of their lines east of Worcester, they either sold, whether it was to the MBTA, Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority, the EOTC, Executive Office of Transportation and Construction, which is separate from the MBTA, and that is one of the ongoing issues that Massachusetts has when it comes to funding rail projects and so on, because you have the MBTA on one hand that has a constant financial drain. Part of that's due to mismanagement. Part of that's due to the fact that some of their operations are probably uneconomical, whether on a free market basis or otherwise. And then you have the EOTC that has a separate budget as well. And so therefore, there are always conflicts between the two agencies as far as how spending will take place, what money has to go to what, and so on. But a lot of the CSX lines, including the Boston and Albany main line east of Worcester, was sold to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We'll just call that to be an umbrella entity. And so what CSX has done, or did prior to taking over Pan Am, was reduce its operations, and even some of the smaller shippers that they continue to serve, they made agreements with Pan Am to take that over. That meant by 2013, Beacon Park Yard closed. and a lot of the property was subsequently sold to Harvard University. Parts of that sale had taken place earlier. More of that sale took place later. The ultimate goal is for Harvard to develop a lot of that area, and we'll probably see expanding things such as its business school and otherwise onto what was for many years rail property. This has not yet taken place, and a portion of the yard has since been reopened to be used for transloading due to a remediation project that's taking place in the area. But now it is quite a bit different from what I saw, and this means that there is now, as I understand it, 2 tracks between CP3 and CP4, and that means both commuter trains and Amtrak's Lakeshore Limited are no longer holding each other up as they go through this area. Now, one of the most interesting things that I got to do for about a month was work on the MBTA Commuter Rail. Now, I was not a conductor and I was not an engineer. I was actually taking surveys. You see, in 2003, the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority contracted with the MBCR, Massachusetts Bay Commuter Railroad, to provide the commuter service. Now, unlike the rapid transit lines, the streetcar, the subway, and so forth, the commuter rail is operated under contract by a variety of different entities, and it's always been this way. The trains were initially operated by actually New Haven and Penn Central. This is what came from the subsidy era when both these railroads would say, hey, look, you know what? Boston and Maine first, then and New Haven, then later on, of course, Penn Central and Boston and Maine. And this is the era when these carriers would say, our services are not only unprofitable, they're a massive drain on us. And if we don't have a way to mitigate this financial drain, not only is it going to impact the company negatively, which of course it did, this helped to drive both the New Haven and the Boston and Maine into bankruptcy in the 1960s, but also that it might threaten the very survival of the companies themselves. Obviously, a bankrupt company, even though that doesn't mean that the company is completely exhausted on its funds, does not generally have the ability to reinvest in its operations, as railroads absolutely must do. So, eliminating the commuter problem was an issue. This was solved in several different ways. The first thing that happened is the MBTA, which was at the time the M.T.A., took over a lot of the right-of-way that the New Haven used for its commuter services in Massachusetts. The New Haven continued to operate the trains over it, and this arrangement passed to Penn Central. Then you had the creation of the MBTA as an actual organization, which would be funding and then later putting its logo on equipment as it purchased it. During this time, though, the railroads would continue to operate their own services. Now, after Conrail was created, and Conrail wanted to get out of the business of commuter rail in any form, whether as a contract operator or as operating trains in principle, as it did in both Ohio on the former Erie-Lackawanna, and then Illinois and Indiana on the Penn Central. And I say that separately from its operations in New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania, which were also being done in conjunction, in those cases, I should say, being done in conjunction with local authorities that helped to fund those services. In Massachusetts, they got out of it completely, and that's how the Boston and Maine became the MBTA's contract operator. Boston and Maine was subsequently replaced by Amtrak, who in 2003 was replaced by the Massachusetts Bay Commuter Railroad, which was a consortium of Connex, which is a European firm that has contract operations all across the world, and also Alternate Concepts Incorporated, which was your Boston political machine, connected folks who one of whom had been working with the MBTA and in some of their administrations previously, but these were guys who were able to open the door because they knew people at the State House and also locally. And this operated between 2003 and 2014 when the current operator Keolis took over. But the MBCR wanted to find out, well, hey, what do people think of the services? So they contracted with Atlantic Research and Consulting, which was known for doing an annual survey of what Bostonians thought of the police department. And they put an ad in Craigslist that said, hey, does anybody want to ride the trains and take surveys? And you're saying, Phil, do you want to ride the train for free? Heck yes. So I managed to ride almost every commuter rail line that the MBTA had on both the north side and the south side, taking surveys. I'd walk into the car when we were departing the original terminal, pass out the surveys, get them back from people. We had these little pencils, little green pencils with MBCR logo on it that we could hand to everybody, and I still kept a bunch of them after the surveys were over. And generally, the commuters were very nice, open, and willing to take the survey, and they all wanted to tell me the same thing, which is that the bathrooms on the trains were absolutely terrible. And yes, they were. So if the MBCR ever fixed that problem, I'm not quite sure, but it was kind of a humorous but enjoyable thing to do. One of the things I remember the most was I was riding one of the trains down to Forge Park, which is in Franklin, and I had a nice conversation with a gray-haired conductor who had started his career on the New Haven. And while I don't remember all of the little intricacies of what we talked about, I just thought it's one of the things that's so unique to railroading. This man had started in an era when obviously the railroads were declining, and what was known as the New Haven being J.P. Morgan's line, control, serving his home territory, and he, really treated it as his parochial interest. That New Haven is where this man had started running. And by the time I met him in 2003, here he is working for the MBCR, Massachusetts Bay Commuter Railroad, having lived through the eras of worked through the eras of Penn Central, Conrail, Boston and Maine, Amtrak, and now the MBCR, not to mention all the other changes that had taken place in the rail industry around it. So to think about, this is someone who is basically a native of the area on his native railroad this time. This is the kind of thing that you rarely see in any other industry or any other place, and I just enjoyed it. So a few odds and ends before we get out of here. The state has, or I should say the Commonwealth up there, they have an amazing transportation library, which is located at the MBTA headquarters at 10 Park Plaza in Boston. For a long time, they had a librarian named George Sanborn, and he would talk to you for any length of time that he could. He would talk to anyone about anything. He absolutely loved electric railways, so that means your streetcars, your subways, and otherwise. My friends, they were out there, they were dating and drinking and doing everything else. And what was I doing? I was learning as much as I could at that transportation library. If you're ever in Boston and you love trains or have even a passing interest, go to the transportation library. You will not be sorry. Next, from 2005 to 2008, I worked at State Street Bank in North Quincy, Massachusetts. Now, I know if you're from up there, you say it's Quincy, which is how they pronounce it there, but that meant riding the red line 5 days per week. And so the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, which were the primary rolling stock that the MBTA was using at the time on the red line, they were a lot of fun to ride. They're also the 1800s, which had AC traction, whereas the others were DC. And it was very interesting to see these cars because the 15 and 1600s, they were built by Pullman Standard in the 1960s, whereas the 1700s were the same design by UTDC about a decade plus later. And then you had the 1800s, completely different, built by General Electric and Bombardier. Getting a chance to see a real rapid transit line 5 days per week and how it was so different from the Green Line and its streetcar, it was a lot of fun, but it also showed you a lot of the difficulties that come with urban rail transport. One of the biggest is that the MBTA, like other systems here in the Washington, D.C. area where I currently live, have 2 tracks, and therefore anything that happens that disrupts one train will then cascade throughout the system very, very quickly. And while your bosses in most places understood this, because a lot of people did use rapid transit, urban transit there, it was never much fun to have a full day of work, which at that point for me pretty much consisted of downloading TPS reports, and I'm not really kidding there. You didn't want to be stuck for too long because, of course, that was really going to monkey up your day, and you only had a few of those before the boss would start tapping you on the shoulder and saying, hey, you need to be making some other arrangements so you get here on time. You also saw how the MBTA could be a very big kaleidoscope, whether it was some people who were very, very devoted to the job and really did what it took to keep things running, to those who simply looked at it as kind of an employment agency for people who shouldn't have jobs. So that meant that the service could be very, very inconsistent. And I'm sure you see this with a lot of other transit authorities around the country. Now, the last thing I wanted to point out was the Blue Line. The Blue Line is the most unique line that the MBTA operates. And we're going to try our luck again to see if we can get you some photos of the Blue Line. Now, the Blue Line runs from Bowdoin Station, which is downtown. And Bowdoin, by the way, is very lightly used. Almost nobody goes there, and periodically the MBTA talks about getting rid of it, but they never do, to a place called Wonderland. And what you're seeing here, these are the Hawker Siddeley cars that are no longer in operation, but they were blue and white. They're very similar to the Orange Line cars, which are called Orange Blossoms. Same length, built by the same people, Hawker Siddeley at the Canadian Car and Foundry plant in Montreal. These cars, though, as you can see, they're equipped to operate on overhead wire. They're also equipped to operate on third rail. And typically, there will be a change made either at Airport Station or at Maverick Station, because you have both third rail and overhead catenary in place between both, between one and the other. Now, the reason for the overhead wire is the line to Wonderland runs along the bay. And so you have a lot of ice that can form on the third rail, especially in the wintertime. So they have the overhead wire. But the interesting part about this, even more so than the change that gets made, is that this used to be a narrow gauge line called the Boston Revere Beach and Lynn. And this, the BRB&L, went all the way out to its namesake city, Lynn. And the MBTA retains the entire right-of-way there. But there is a very sad and but interesting story of how the BRB&L was a very well-regarded narrow gauge route. It was actually called the narrow gauge that served a lot of commuters in East Boston, Revere Beach, and so on. But it fell into financial trouble, as many carriers did in that era. And as time went on, there was a big push for the state to come along and either subsidize it, bail it out in some form, and they refused to, and it was all torn up. But then the M.T.A. first came along and put new track on it, which is standard gauge, and that is what became the Blue Line. They connected that with the East Boston Tunnel, which goes under the bay and gets out to the airport area, which is where you have the third rail operation. That had always existed. That never ceased operations. And that is what now forms today's Blue Line. So you have a lot of heritage both with the East Boston Tunnel and also the BRB&L. If you're out at the East Broad Top in Orbezonia, Pennsylvania, they are currently restoring one of the old BRB&L and one of the few pieces of equipment that actually exists, one of their old coaches, that will be used on their narrow gauge lines, which is currently expanding and hopefully one day will encompass all of that East Broad Top that originally operated. I went out there early after I got to BU, and I looked at the map and I saw it runs from Bowdoin, which I couldn't pronounce. I was calling it Bowdoin. Bowdoin, that's how you pronounce it, all the way out to Wonderland. And I said, what is Wonderland? Is this some kind of like Alice in Wonderland joke stuff? I mean, I don't know. I got to go see this. So I got on the train. I paid my 85 cents, went out there. And what is Wonderland? Well, Wonderland is a dog track. And, some of you are animal rights activists and probably think it's terrible, but it certainly was a different thing to go out and watch dogs running around. Didn't place any bets, but it's something you don't see in a lot of places, although for many years it was big in the Boston area. So that is a little bit about my time as a rail enthusiast in Boston and some of the odds and ends that I got to enjoy, whether it was riding the train or getting a chance to rail fan. And I remember riding an excursion on the P&W, Providence and Worcester, with their equipment. And also joined the Big Brothers program for a brief time. I had a little brother who loved trains, and I great guy. Stayed in touch with him a little bit through Facebook over the years. And that, I just want to end on that note. Please do whatever you can if you know anybody out there who shares your love of railroads even just a little bit. Because anything that you can do to nurture that, whether it's sending them to a good website like allthingstrains.com where they can learn more, giving them an extra book or a magazine or something like that you might have in your collection that you're willing to part with, that kind of thing will really help to nurture them and let them know that they are not alone. Because a lot of people out there will, you have something that's a hobby, it's something you care about, But if your friends aren't into it, they'll make fun of you, laugh at you, and you say, well, okay, I'll put it aside. Don't let that happen. So put your arm around somebody, give them the opportunity and say, hey, you know what? There are other rail enthusiasts out there, and help them nurture that, because it's a positive thing to do, to have these hobbies and be willing and able to enjoy them. We will be back with you on Wednesday when I promise you we will be talking about regional railroads and Class 1 railroads that have gotten involved in the regional rail business. Thank you so much for being part of this here at All Things Trains, and we will see you down the main line.